Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at a very heavily requested monitor, the Eve Spectrum ES07D03, otherwise known as the Eve Spectrum 4K. The first reviews of this monitor went up on other channels and websites many months ago now, but the reason our review has been delayed is we decided to buy one and it took a fair while to arrive, so better late than never though, right? We decided to buy Spectrum 4K because Eve as a company doesn't have a great track record in delivering products and keeping to promises. Their previous product, the EV laptop/tablet device, was plagued with production issues and delays, and the refund process for customers has been pretty poor to say the least, judging by various user reports. Eve did offer us a review unit, but we wanted to assess whether they would actually deliver a monitor to us after pre-ordering and to see what the whole process is like. I was somewhat concerned that the product could be a scam, for example, taking pre-orders and never shipping units to customers beyond the first wave and to reviewers. So we secret shopped this monitor to a different address and details so Eve wouldn't know it was us. I specifically ordered one after the first wave of reviews to emulate the experience of a buyer who watched one of those reviews from samples that were sent out and then wanted to make a purchase. The good news is that the product arrived, but the bad news is pretty much everything else. To keep this simple so we can get into the actual review, I bought the monitor at the end of July and put down a $100 reservation with Eve, claiming a shipping date of September 2021. They requested the remaining payment in the middle of August, claiming the product was almost ready to ship. However, that shipment didn't actually occur until October 4th, a month and a half later, and it ended up arriving at its destination on October 12th. Now, normally, that's probably not too much of an issue. I bought it knowing full well it wouldn't ship until September, and it took a few weeks more to actually arrive, so I guess a short delay. However, the real stinger is that on top of paying $800 for the monitor and stand, the only option for shipping was to pay $184 for supposedly express shipping. Granted, we are in Australia, and this included import duties, but to pay for a monitor that was almost ready to ship in the middle of August, then to wait 2 months for it to arrive, and part of that was 2 weeks of actual transportation time, doesn't exactly feel like express shipping or that I got my money's worth there, especially when basically every other monitor I can just buy from a local store at a fraction of the shipping cost. So the buying experience wasn't great, and while it could have been worse, they could have pulled an EV and delayed it by a year or just never shipped it, starting off a review process by paying exorbitant shipping fees and waiting months, it isn't ideal. But for now, let's shift more into a look at the actual hardware Eve are offering. The Eve Spectrum 4K is a 27-inch 4K 144Hz gaming monitor with all the usual features. It supports adaptive sync variable refresh rates, it has 1 millisecond rated response times through the use of an LG IPS panel, and it has HDR 600 rating with up to 750 nits of brightness. The big selling point here used to be HDMI 2.1, although in 2021 it's not particularly special as lots of 4K monitors include that feature. Eve also claims the display was crowd developed by 4,053 members of their community, so it'll be interesting to see whether that's made a difference to the final product. As mentioned, I paid $800 for my Spectrum 4K excluding shipping, although that price has since increased to $900 with shipments for new orders estimated for January, which will probably be February or later in reality. The $900 payment is split into $800 for the monitor itself and $100 for the stand. So if you don't want a stand, for example, if you're going to be VESA mounting, then you can save yourself $100, which is, I guess, a nice feature. The design of the Spectrum, it's pretty good, and while the stand is pricey as a $100 part of the package, it's quite an elegant product. The base and pillar are both made from metal with a pleasing grey finish, and the range of height adjustment is excellent, in addition to pivot and tilt support. Even though the stand is thin and the base not particularly large, it's sturdy overall and feels well built. I like the design of the display itself, slim bezels, no unnecessary gamer-style junk, no RGB LEDs. Overall, this would be up there among one of my favourite gaming monitor designs. The slim section on the rear houses all of the ports, including one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC and two HDMI 2.1 ports. The inclusion of HDMI 2.1 is critical on a 4K 144Hz monitor as you're limited to just 60Hz without it, and these are full 48 gigabits per second ports. Then there's also a USB-C input which supports DP alt mode and 100 watts of power delivery, which is pretty neat for single cable use with laptops. Several USB outputs are also included along with an audio jack, so pretty good range of ports all up. As for the on-screen display, we get an easy to operate directional toggle on the rear, although the interface itself is basic and surprisingly low resolution on a native 4K panel. The range of included features, it's okay. It does have crosshair support, which most other monitors do have, plus the neat inclusion of integer scaling, which can improve clarity when upscaling 1080p to 4K directly. I wouldn't say the feature set is amazing though, as competitors like Gigabyte offer alternative stuff like KVM switches, which you don't get here. Looking at response time performance, the Spectrum is interesting in that it provides a couple of overdrive settings in addition to user customizable overdrive through a slider. I like this setup a lot, and you can really fine tune the settings, so let's see how it performs. Overdrive off performance is fairly typical of LG's Nano IPS panels with a 9 millisecond average response time and no overshoot. This mode is actually decently usable, but we can improve performance by using a higher mode. Next up the chain is the normal mode, which appears to be the most balanced between response times and overshoot. There is a small amount of overshoot detected, mostly in close together transitions, which in practice isn't noticeable while gaming. The average response has improved to a very solid 5 milliseconds on average, which is what Eve advertises as the panel's typical response. Cumulative deviation is also better here than in the prior mode. The high mode is your typical too fast mode that's designed to advertise a faster response time than what the LCD panel can actually achieve. While the response time average is better than the normal mode, overshoot is significant and noticeable, leading to inverse ghosting trails. Cumulative deviation is worse than the normal mode, so we've gone backwards here when weighing up the balance between speed and overshoot. Beyond this, you can control overdrive via the user customizable slider, which allows values between 0 and 63. However, I found that a significant portion of the range is pretty useless with quite a high level of overshoot. So I'll cut to the chase here. When optimizing for the lowest cumulative deviation, I found a value of approximately 15 to give the best experience at 144 Hz. This setting is slightly slower than the normal mode, but to a negligible degree really, but it has a low amount of overshoot as well. This is what I'd use for high refresh rate gaming, although the normal mode is also pretty solid if you just don't want to mess around. As for adaptive sync gaming across the refresh range, Eve claims the monitor has variable overdrive, although I don't see any evidence of this in practice. They might be incorrectly using the term to mean the user customizable overdrive setting, which is different to actual variable overdrive, where the monitor automatically adjusts its overdrive settings depending on the refresh rate for the best experience. The basics here are that using a user setting of 15 for overdrive causes a bit too much inverse ghosting at 60 Hz. After careful examination of a range of overdrive options, I ended up settling on a user setting of 10 for the best experience across the refresh range. This mode is a little slower at 144 Hz at a 6.55 millisecond response time average, but it still packs great performance with a limited amount of overshoot at 60 Hz and everything in between those refresh rates. Using this mode provides what I'd describe as a single overdrive mode experience, even if it technically doesn't use variable overdrive. Compared to other monitors, the Eve Spectrum is decent at its maximum 144 Hz refresh rate. Response times are in the ballpark of other IPS monitors, while retaining a low level of inverse ghosting. I was able to tune the monitor using the user adjustable overdrive to be slightly better than LG's 27GN950 as well, which uses a similar panel. On average across the refresh range, the Spectrum and 27GN950 are virtually identical. While it's nice to get all that user customizable overdrive controls to get the best out of the display, it seems LG is already doing that for you with their offerings, so this doesn't give Eve a big advantage on average. Performance here, again, it is solid and well balanced, though a monitor like the Gigabyte M28U isn't all that different if we're being honest, providing fast response times at the cost of a bit more overshoot. And that's seen further when looking at cumulative deviation, which shows the bounce between response times and overshoot. The Gigabyte M28U performs well here, among the best for an IPS monitor. The 27GN950 and Eve Spectrum are slightly behind, although really all these monitors deliver a very similar experience on average. The performance is right where I'd want it to be for a modern IPS gaming monitor, which is a result between 500 and 600 in this metric. At 120Hz, the Spectrum is a mid-table performer, delivering decent results for console gamers looking at that 4K 120Hz experience over HDMI 2.1. Then at 60Hz, the Spectrum is once again pretty typical in terms of its performance with no notable issues. It's slightly slower than the 27GN950, but not to the degree where you should complain, as basically those two monitors deliver the same performance. Input lag is a non-issue with the Spectrum, providing less than 1 millisecond of processing delay and mid-tier results all up. The main limiting factor for input latency here is the refresh rate, as 144Hz is noticeably slower than 240Hz or higher monitors in terms of lag and smoothness. At this sort of price point, you can toss up between 4K 144Hz or 1440p 240Hz, so if you play a lot of competitive titles, the faster refresh rate may be of interest to you. Then we get to power consumption. Unsurprisingly, the 27GN950 and ES07D03 are basically identical for power consumption when calibrated to the same brightness output. Both use the same panel, so I wouldn't expect anything different here. The Eve Spectrum supports backlight strobing, and it's a really great implementation, especially for this sort of panel. Their built-in presets have minimal strobe crosstalk or double images, leading to noticeably improved clarity compared to running without strobing, and not that many artifacts aside from a slight trail. You get the best image quality with the short pulse width, but the lowest brightness, although even the long pulse width with a high level of brightness is still pretty decent. This can be further tweaked using either their built-in user controls in the OSD or the Blurbuster's strobe utility for the optimal results. This level of flexibility and control over the strobing mode is what other companies should be aiming for with their modes, because it always delivers the best results. The Eve Spectrum ends up with great strobing and a large degree of flexibility, including the ability to use strobing with any refresh rate such as 60Hz, which is not possible with many other monitors. However, there are some drawbacks. Overall strobe quality, it isn't perfect due to the persistent issue with KSF backlight LCDs, which is the slow red phosphor. This causes red trails when using backlight strobing, and this can be quite noticeable even when the level of strobe crosstalk is low. For that reason, you may not want to use it. Eve also doesn't support using backlight strobing and adaptive sync simultaneously, which is increasing in popularity with other brands. Moving now into color performance, and the Eve Spectrum is a typical wide gamut monitor using an LG panel. It has 97% DCI-P3 coverage, which is very wide and well suited to work in that color space. Beyond that, support for Adobe RGB is more limited, and overall Rec 2020 coverage is 71%, which is an average result by modern monitor standards. Default factory calibration was pretty good with my unit, at least for grayscale performance. The CCT curve is impressively flat and balanced, leading to perfect tone out of the box. The gamma performance isn't perfect, but decent enough, and that leads to good Delta E results. However, the default experience using the Spectrum is its wide gamut mode, despite the majority of SDR content only using or requiring sRGB/Rec 709. What this means is by default, the panel is oversaturated. So what we see when compared to other monitors is that the Eve is quite average in color checker performance, but pretty decent for grayscale performance, at least in its default state. However, performance can be improved notably by switching the monitor over to its sRGB mode. Grayscale Delta E's drop in this configuration to below 1.0 in Delta E 2000 and just 3.0 in Delta E ITP, which is very good, despite some inconsistencies with the gamma curve. Color performance, it's also very strong as the color gamut is being managed perfectly, and this leads to no oversaturation. All up, this sRGB mode is a lot better than average and very usable without any further calibration. You also get great results for P3 when the monitor is set to its P3 mode, with Delta E performance here that's very similar to the sRGB mode. This means there's a strong level of hardware calibration for both of the color spaces the display supports, and calibration can only improve things slightly. I would like to see the sRGB mode unlock white balance controls. They are locked, which isn't a huge deal here, but it's still unnecessary. But outside of that, I'm very happy with the calibration being provided here, so long as you switch it into the sRGB mode for everyday use. Brightness is decent, offering 450 nits in its SDR mode, which is only beaten by true HDR panels like the PG32 UQX. This level of brightness is similar to the LG 27GN950, but a lot better than the Gigabyte M28U. Minimum brightness isn't amazing though at 76 nits, which should be fine for most users but isn't as low as other monitors can go. Native contrast ratio is solid at 1160:1 with my unit. The 4K version of LG's Nano IPS panel doesn't suffer from the same contrast issues as with the 1440p versions, and the EVE spectrum was even a little better than my 27GN950 sample from LG. Unfortunately though, contrast is poor in general due to being an IPS panel. VA displays have more than twice the level of contrast, which makes them more suited to dark content or playing games in the dark. Viewing angles and uniformity were both good, and LG panels tend to have above average uniformity, which is great for content creation. The main part of the screen was very uniform with my unit, and there was only a small amount of fall off in the upper right corner. I should note that uniformity is unit dependent and what you receive may be different. As for HDR performance, the EVE Spectrum is a semi-HDR monitor. While it does pack respectable brightness capabilities, a wide color gamut, and some form of local dimming to improve the contrast ratio, it fundamentally lacks the hardware for true HDR visuals. The monitor only has 16 edge-lit dimming zones, which leads to a lot of blooming and haloing when viewing HDR content. In a lot of cases, all dimming zones are illuminated, which prevents the display from actually showing bright and dark areas close together. To quickly run through HDR performance, the maximum brightness the panel can achieve is solid at around the 700 nit mark where they're sustained, as a flash, or at small window sizes. In fact, across various window sizes, the brightness never dips below 600 nits, whether sustained or peak, which leads to solid brightness, especially at normal monitor viewing distances. Where the spectrum suffers is in contrast. The absolute best contrast ratio I could achieve was 20,000:1, which was between a full black window and a full white window, hardly a realistic use case for HDR. Within a single frame, the best I could achieve dropped to just 11,600:1, which is well short of the sorts of contrast ratios HDR is recommended for. And then in the worst cases, when dark and bright objects are on screen side by side, the spectrum reverts to its native contrast ratio. So in those situations, it's not capable of HDR level performance at all. You can get a better than SDR experience some of the time, but most of the time the experience is quite poor, so I wouldn't buy this for its HDR specs or capabilities. The EVE Spectrum 4K, it's in a bit of an odd position all up. There's a decent amount of stuff to like from a performance perspective that's then let down by other issues like the company's release strategy and its price tag, so let's break it down. Outside of HDR, where the spectrum is not very good, this monitor performs very well. Response times are decent and right where you'd want them to be for a modern IPS gaming monitor, plus we get very good backlight strobing and important feature inclusions like HDMI 2.1. This isn't as revolutionary as it once was now that we have much more competition in the 4K 144Hz monitor space, but the spectrum ticks all the boxes for motion performance and it's pretty great to game on. Color performance is what I liked the most here. Factory calibration in the sRGB mode is very good, and it's clear EVE spent time ensuring each unit does actually pass through some sort of factory calibration process. It's also well suited to content creation in the P3 mode, which has decent hardware calibration as well. Throw in good uniformity and contrast, and there's a great amount of versatility here to use the monitor for gaming and production work, which you'd want out of a 4K monitor. While performance is strong and the Spectrum packs a modern feature set, I don't think the whole crowd developed thing has added much to this display at all. There's a few things in here they might not have included otherwise, like integer scaling support, but it shouldn't take an online forum for a monitor maker to realize that they should probably factory calibrate their high-end display or to optimize the backlight strobing. That aspect is a bit gimmicky to me. I've seen several other monitors with the features and performance EVE are offering here without being crowd developed, so yeah, not a big deal to me. As for its direct competitors, with EVE charging $900 for this display, including the stand, it competes at the high end of the 4K 144Hz market with products like LG's 27GP950, the newer version of the 27GN950 you've seen throughout this video. The Spectrum 4K is a better version of the 27GN950 with better performance, so from that perspective, it's a decent option if you want something very good and high end. However, I wouldn't automatically recommend the Spectrum when products like Gigabyte's M28U exist. At just $650, the M28U is pretty similar to the Spectrum in performance, including strong response times, HDMI 2.1, and great factory calibration, but it's clearly a lot cheaper. The Spectrum, like the 27GP950, is not a great value choice, and you're ending up paying a big premium for only a few extras. This display might be the way to go if you desperately want the backlight strobing or integer scaling, but for everyone else, the latest generation of 28-inch 4K monitors offers better bang for buck. What I really don't like about the Spectrum is the release strategy. Eve were taking pre-orders for this display in the middle of last year with an expected release date at the end of 2020. Back then, the monitor was supposed to only be $700 with the stand included, and Eve were heavily touting being the first 4K gaming monitor with HDMI 2.1. If the Spectrum was released when it was supposed to be released at its original price, it would have been an excellent product in that market and hard to go past, which would explain why so many people jumped on board to pre-order. But delaying the product well into 2021 saw Eve lose their competitive advantage. New 4K monitors hit the market earlier this year, delivering a lot of what Eve were promising at similar or better price points, and these options were being offered without massive shipping delays, pre-order garbage, or ridiculous shipping prices. Yet a lot of people had already pre-ordered the monitor without it arriving yet, so you have to wonder how many were just sitting there watching displays like the Gigabyte M28U come out and wondering whether they'd wasted all this time and money on their Spectrum pre-order. And to make matters worse, since then the display has gotten $200 more expensive. We always recommend against pre-ordering, but I think this is a prime example of why you shouldn't and why a company's entire launch strategy shouldn't be based around it. The Spectrum 4K is a good monitor, but it's nothing overly special in today's market, whereas it could have been had they met their promises. Then we get to other issues with this monitor, some of which are specific to companies like Australia. The Eve Spectrum is so ludicrously expensive to ship outside of territories like the US that you simply should not consider it. My order cost 1,340 Australian dollars all up, noting that when I bought the display it was $100 US cheaper, so you're probably looking at about a $1,500 Australian, that is, monitor all up right now that also won't ship for months. So just go to your favorite store and buy something like an M28U for only $1,000, or take that $1,500 and upgrade yourself to a larger, better 32-inch monitor. The hassle of choosing Eve just isn't worth it in places like Australia. And then we get to the final word, which is the Eve Spectrum 4K a scam? That's something I wanted to assess with this review, and I don't think it quite qualifies as being a scam, because they do actually ship your product eventually, and that product is decent. But that doesn't stop the company itself, Eve, being pretty dodgy in my opinion. The release strategy, as we've just been talking about, is not something I'm a fan of, and I think they ended up misleading or leading on a lot of customers with the way that they went about the pre-order process, and the constant delays is really not something that I think is particularly acceptable. And then on top of the shipping issues, the production delays, and the whole pre-order system, which I was not a huge fan of, Eve were also recently caught manipulating the votes in Arting's monitor selection tool, which is what users of their website use to choose the next monitors that they then go and review. That sort of thing is just totally unacceptable, and it's really not required for a product like this. I just don't really understand why Eve would do something like that. It looks super dodgy, it looks bad, it's not necessary, and companies, if you're watching, just don't do stuff like that. It negatively affects your product and brand image. It's a stupid choice, and I think that just adds to the overall, I guess, my dislike of the way that Eve operates as a company. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there, especially just make monitors, make them available to ship straight away, don't offer pre-orders, and don't go around messing around with websites' review tools, because yeah, it's just not great. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Eve Spectrum 4K. If you're interested in supporting the channel, because we did end up paying for this monitor, so if you want to support us buying monitors like this and sort of also assessing some of the buying process, especially when companies are potentially doing dodgy stuff, then please consider supporting us on Patreon and Floatplane. We do really appreciate all of you guys that help us buy stuff like this. We just reviewed a MacBook Pro as well. We bought that as well. So if you're wondering where that money goes, it goes to stuff like this. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.